Peter said to him, "Even though all become deserters, I will not." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer." Amen. Please be seated. Well, blessed Palm Sunday, friends. And today we enter Holy Week. We follow Jesus' journey to the cross. It seems like this service is meant to give us a sneak peek at the emotional extremes that we will experience throughout this week. Feels like a while ago, but we started with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but then almost immediately shifted into hearing the story of his passion. And the juxtaposition of these stories is striking. One minute the crowd is cheering for him, waving palms around and yelling, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." And the next they shout, "Crucify him," demanding that a murderer is released instead of him. And it seems like it's the speed at which the crowd shifts that is just so shocking to the system. It shows how easily we can go from marching alongside Jesus, cheering him on, to turning on him. How quickly we can go from being rooted in the mission of justice and righteousness to siding with the powers and the principalities of this world. You'll recall that before coming to SAM, I served in Indianapolis for over 4 years. And part of my ministry was spending a lot of time in the public sphere, which included a lot of time in the State House testifying about legislation. And multiple times I found myself calling on these public officials to vote down bills that attacked vulnerable members of our community. One such bill was Senate Bill 480, which banned gender-affirming care for trans children and youth. As part of the hours of public testimony, I read a letter signed by over 130 faith leaders and added my own personal comments, calling on them to listen to the science and to protect these vulnerable members of our community. Recall that the Senate gallery was packed that day. And if you know the Indiana State House, all the areas around it were packed too. There were hundreds of people there. The treatment that was being discussed, debated really, consisted of hormones and puberty blockers. See, surgery is not allowed for individuals under the age of 18 in those circumstances. So medical providers, advocates, faith leaders, along with parents and a few affected youth, testified that day. And the medical testimony was and is clear. Those treatments lower the risk of self-harm significantly. None of the treatments discussed are permanent. And they all require multiple doctors to work with these children and parents to determine the correct course of treatment. We heard heartbreaking stories that day that were shared by parents and doctors about how devastating it was when their children and these parents were not heard and their understanding of self honored. Watching parents wrestle with the reality of their child contemplating severe self-harm was just heart-wrenching. Watching them share that fear as a parent and a pastor was devastating. One of the likely outcomes of the legislation was that individuals who were already taking medication would be forced to detransition. Watching children and parents who had traversed the long path to gender transition pour their hearts out to these leaders who ignored their life experiences, and the medical professionals. Friends, it was unbearable to watch. It was unbearable to watch their cries for mercy and justice being completely ignored. Despite the empirical evidence that banning this treatment would lead to significant increases in self-harm, the overwhelming public testimony against the bill, and that this treatment is considered a basic human right in most of the Western world, the legislature voted overwhelmingly to pass the bill, and the governor signed it immediately. Now, thankfully, several families filed suit, arguing that the ban violated the rights of these parents to choose how to care for their own children, and an injunction barred the bill from going into effect. And for almost a year, that was the status quo. The law was blocked. But late in the day, a few weeks ago, on February 27th, an appeals court lifted the injunction, and the law went into effect immediately. Really, overnight, the landscape for these families and for these children changed, and they scrambled to care for their beloved children. So this past month has been filled with conversations with dear friends and colleagues as they navigate how to care for these vulnerable, grieving families, along with my own feelings of guilt at having not been there to care for folks who mean the world to me. But then last week I got a call from a dear friend who needed a favor. In addition to being a seminary student, they work directly with these families who have been most impacted by this law. They themselves are trans, and they stockpiled medications, having recognized the possibility for this outcome when the bill was passed. And they'd set up somewhat a clandestine meeting to meet with families and pass these medications along. They couldn't share the details with their own spouse or with others because of the legal risk it would pose to their licenses as therapists and as social workers. So they called me, so someone would know about the meeting in the event that they were arrested. And we've had this type of relationship since middle of 2020. You can imagine the context then. So this is not a new thing for us to be ready to be needed to bail the other one out from jail. The meeting went off without a hitch, and these kids got the medication that they needed. And at a time when standing up for trans kids isn't safe, as evidenced by the tragic death of Nex Benedict, my dear friend continues to show up, to bear witness for those who are most vulnerable. They are always rooted in justice, often at great risk to themselves. So as we hear how fast the crowd turns from shouting Hosanna to crucify him, we hear and see how hard it is to stay rooted in the work of justice. And we see this reflected in Peter's actions most acutely. Even though Jesus tells him directly, I know that you love me, but you will deny me, he still does it 3 times. Being so rooted in Jesus' message of love, the message of care for the most vulnerable, the message of justice, is maybe the hardest part of the Christian walk. Power is seductive, and it's natural to be concerned with our own safety, whether real or perceived. And that is on full display in Mark's gospel for us. The crowd cheers for Jesus, showering him with praise and their possessions along the road. They are safe and proud in those moments. The reality of Roman occupation is nowhere to be seen, and the potential for God's goodness is palpable. Hope is palpable in that moment. But over the course of the next few days, that of course changes. The mood of the crowd shifts as the Roman authorities crack down. The possibilities of true safety and true freedom in God's kingdom is weighed to the stark reality of occupied rule and the fear that comes with it. It requires being deeply rooted in love and justice to withstand the power of fear. So as we enter Holy Week, we will bear witness to the extremes of the human experience. The highs of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the Last Supper, saying goodbye to his closest followers, the devastating abandonment and betrayal by those followers, his trial, execution, and finally his resurrection. It's a reminder that following Jesus is not for the faint of heart. Power, or even being close to power, is seductive. Power can make us feel safe, but it's not rooted in the work of justice or righteousness, and certainly not in Jesus. I have to admit to you, friends, that reliving those hours in that Senate chamber still tears at my heart a year later. And over the last month, I fielded calls from dear friends who find themselves just trying to care for families who are in despair. They're worried about their kids, they're worried for themselves, along with so many others who are directly and indirectly impacted. And so hearing the crowd shout, "Crucify him, crucify him," this takes me right back to that moment. And the depth of despair that Jesus' closest followers must have felt feels really tangible. And yet, hearing my friend tell me about this underground network of hormones and resources for these kids and these families, that is the hope of the gospel embodied. It recalls that death and despair do not have the last word in the gospel story. Even Peter, after denying Jesus and living with that guilt, comes back to be fully rooted in the work of the gospel for the rest of his own life, because death and despair will never have the last word. We can be rooted enough in the work of justice to withstand the pull of power. We can be rooted in righteousness enough to push back on the narratives that marginalize and isolate the most vulnerable members of our communities. And we can be so rooted in Jesus that nothing will separate us from standing up to the evil of this world, so that no one faces despair, isolation, or oppression anymore.